I just want to start off with saying that I definitely empathize with the view, just like I did in 2016 and other elections. The Trump ticket was the lesser of two evils. But I think after the first Trump term and the precedent set by campaign rhetoric versus policy action in that first term, I've been really skeptical that won't repeat itself. And so you're already seeing, since Trump was elected, sort of these signaling that, someone like Mike Pompeo or some figures that have neoconservative bents, like Marco Rubio's being considered for a cabinet position. Mike Pompeo's been fielded for Secretary of Defense. People that worked right under Pompeo have been tapped to lead the transition team for the State Department, things of that nature. The apparent signaling and claims from people like Howard Lutnick, co-chair of the Trump transition team, that RFK isn't really going to have any role in any sort of HHS or HHS sub-agency. Are these the beginning signs of backpedaling? I think it's fair to be skeptical and be vigilant. Particularly what I would warn against is the idea that now that the lesser of two evils has won, now is the time to sit back and just let things happen and not hold anyone's feet to the fire and not ensure accountability. Because I think that's, a recipe for disaster, frankly, when people are complacent and too trusting. Consistently, politicians abuse that. And there's a very long track record of that happening in American politics with both parties. And what I've been saying a lot since the election is that complacency and the efforts to manufacture it are dangerous, I would say. And what I'm concerned about is that the people that were most against a lot of these efforts to undermine our freedoms, a lot of them being on the right, for example, are people that were, dissidents of the COVID era and COVID era policies, and gun owners, for example, who obviously have a way to impact the fate of the country if things were ever to get really, tyrannical. If they're overly trusting of the federal government, they're more likely to be complacent and sort of just sit back and not really do anything because they trust the person that is in power. And unfortunately, I think there's bipartisan agendas that even with in 2016, Republicans also sweep the legislature. They took the executive branch, but it didn't result in the populist platform that was necessarily promised. So I think, if people don't want to ensure that the country does go on a better track, there needs to be pushback, and people need to not just, sit back in their armchairs and trust the plan or what have you, and need to really ensure that, like I've said for a long time, since I get accused of not offering any solutions, I've said for a really long time that I have long believed that change is going to come from the bottom up, not the top down, and that people need to really ensure and focus on their local communities, on local resilience, and on building out alternatives that can help us resist a lot of these technocratic agendas that seek to micromanage and control, essentially every aspect of our lives. One thing I want to bring up about people like Gillibrand, especially Lummis, frames a lot of her crypto advocacy as necessary to ensure dollar hegemony. And so as I understand it, and a lot of, rhetoric I've heard in the Bitcoin space for years is that fiat is terrible. It's broken money. We need to move on from fiat. And so hearing things like that from Lummis, hearing Trump at the Bitcoin conference say, actually, the Bitcoin and the dollar are not competing. Bitcoin is going to strengthen the dollar and all of this stuff, I think should be a harbinger for concern for people that don't want a debt-based monetary future. And unfortunately, it's essentially been admitted that the next president, who we know now will be Trump, is going to face some sort of U.S. government debt crisis. And of course, that debt crisis is the consequence of wildly irresponsible fiscal policy, right? What I am concerned about is that there will be no accountability for that. There is a plan to use things that were meant, or at least pitched, as destroying fiat and the debt-based monetary system. It will likely be deflationary, but only because they've stolen all of the assets and really most things of value. So at that point, they do want a deflationary system because they have hoarded all of the wealth and they don't want their wealth to inflate away now that they hold almost all of the cards. And so, what concerns me there then is like the stablecoin play, as we said it for, a long time, stablecoins have the potential to be just as programmable and surveillable as a CBDC could be, and the Fed and the national security community, meaning, the CIA, among other agencies, have been very open that stablecoins will ensure dollar hegemony. And you have, stablecoins like Tether, for example, saying that we're a partner of US dollar hegemony. And, Trump with his family's, stablecoin project having recently come out, it's about globalizing the dollar. Maybe not that necessarily, but it shows that the intent is to globalize the dollar and essentially use dollar stablecoins, not that aren't necessarily directly issued by the US government, but will be regulated by it to become, essentially a de facto world currency. That's essentially the push. And it's essentially been happening relatively quietly for some time in economies that are dramatically unstable and had been made unstable by entities like the IMF, for example, which, the US military refers to the IMF as a financial weapon of military power of the United States government. And then Argentina, of course, a lot of people are using Tether because their local currency is no good. And that's happening in other places around the world that have also been subjected, to essentially financial warfare by these same predatory, again, debt slavery model-based institutions. And so will this actually improve the situation? Will it prevent future irresponsible fiscal policy if this is what ultimately ends up happening? It will come down to people resisting that and saying, no, that's not okay. If really it is true that people in the Bitcoin space are opposed to debt slavery and debt-based monetary paradigm, which is what I have heard for a long time, and I absolutely agree with that. And I am also concerned about the introduction now of climate finance as a way to use carbon market schemes or other forms of carbon pricing, or some of these efforts to securitize the natural world, like one that was recently we wrote about the Amazon rainforest, for example, being securitized by the guy that invented ETFs and used to be head of BlackRock's global investments or something like that. These are going to be used as different places to shovel debt, because if you have a huge debt crisis, you're looking for things to, shovel the debt into to make your debt problem go away. And so, as we've talked about, an effort to securitize the natural world and create this new asset class, that these groups that back this call nature's economy, because they can, essentially quadruple or quintuple the amount of assets in the current economy and basically keep the existing casino model that Wall Street and these criminal banks have, go on forever. They need that new asset class to keep their models going, that generate them a lot of money. And the fact that, there's all these efforts from people like Lummis and Gillibrand and others that want to support the dual banking system that rewards irresponsible government fiscal policy and criminal acts of the private banks, I'm concerned about that. And the fact that, in Trump's administration in particular, you have someone like Howard Lutnick closely tied to Tether, but also very connected to ESG, the Sustainable Development Goals. Cantor Fitzgerald has an entire fund dedicated to implementing the UN Sustainable Development Goals, right? Which includes, by the way, digital ID is part of that, and programmable surveillable money linking a digital ID to some sort of CBDC or UBI biometric wallet and all of this stuff. This is in the SDGs, and he's on the board of this company that we've talked about most of this year, actually called Satellogic, that is involved in several efforts to securitize nature and turn basically things like the Amazon rainforest into, tradable financial products that don't actually conserve anything but are framed as that. And then, this effort to basically install a predatory global carbon market over Latin America that at the same time it ends local and national sovereignty, or would de facto end it and lead toward a more regional government and regional government block and try and build out like a smart power grid and 5G stuff throughout the continent under the guise of conserving it and ending climate change. Ultimately, the goal is really just to use that stuff to shovel debt someplace. And even RFK Jr.'s former VP pick, Nicole Shanahan, she's led research projects about how to facilitate quantitative easing by quantitatively easing into, carbon sequestration projects and tokenized carbon credits and carbon coins. So this is something that is definitely being talked about by figures that are around the current administration. And if there is a debt crisis, even though, Trump pulled people out of the Paris Accords and all of that stuff. I mean, Elon Musk quit all the advisory panels and councils he was on in the first Trump administration because Trump ended the US's commitment to the Paris agreements, right? But this time he's obviously come back in a big way, and as recently as February was pushing for carbon taxes and some other form of carbon pricing, and has been a big advocate for that for really several years. There's a lot of Republicans actually that were pushing for carbon taxes when Trump was in office last time. He didn't listen to them, but if it's considered or framed as necessary because of a debt crisis or something like that, the tune may change. And, with someone like Lutnick, he's not Larry Fink, but he's certainly not like an anti-ESG guy and not an anti-climate finance guy. And if you look into carbon carbon markets or any of this other stuff. The reason they've been failing is because they're exposed time and time again as scams. So now the new thing is to frame them as high integrity carbon markets. But you're never going to get a freaking high integrity carbon market when it's criminal bankers making them up. Because criminal bankers do one thing, and that's steal. And so, I mean, that's what the carbon market they will do. It's essentially inevitable. That is unfortunate. You have Kamala's economic team and Biden's economic team essentially being run by BlackRock executives. And then, when Trump was in office last time, Larry Fink had basically, BlackRock designed U.S. fiscal response to COVID that they began implementing before a pandemic was even declared. It resulted in one of the biggest wealth transfers in American history and printed more money than at any other time in U.S. history. And, that was BlackRock, and they're not going away. And the fact that Fink is like, we work with both administrations. I mean, they worked with Obama during 2008, they worked with Trump, and they worked with Biden, and would have worked with Kamala. Yeah, he's retired the term ESG and uses things like sustainable investing and climate finance and other terms now. But he openly says that it was never about conservation or saving the planet. It's about profits. And if you look at Larry Fink's track record, like what I just mentioned with COVID fiscal policy, their track record is basically stealing wealth from the public and then using control they take over corporations or pension funds or, other things like that to try and force behavioral changes among corporations and the American public. And what sort of behavioral changes does Larry Fink want? I think we all know by now. And, what concerns me is that one of the top people being floated for a Treasury Secretary position under the new Trump administration is this James Paulson guy, who was one of the most successful 2008 criminals and made more money than anyone else, but really should have been prosecuted for the way he did that, because the bank he worked with, Goldman Sachs, actually ended up sort of getting prosecuted for it. No one was really prosecuted in 2008, but there were civil cases, very few, and it was called Abacus, and there was another one that Paulson and Goldman Sachs worked on together, and that was one of the few that was so egregious it actually resulted in a civil lawsuit, even though, yes, no bankers went to jail, no banks were really punished. There were some fines handed out, but there was really no accountability. And when you have that scale of wealth transfer and theft happen with no accountability, you can be sure that the same people responsible for that were like, we can continue to fleece the public and steal more if we do it the right way. And as I understand it, the other pick is Scott Bessent, who is a former money manager for George Soros, which at least doesn't suggest that it will be fundamentally different than preceding Treasury Secretary policy at the end of the day. And there are some people in his camp that are big, sound money people and backing the dollar with something of substance. Maybe something will come of that. But what has been most telegraphed has generally been this Bitcoin dollar stablecoin play. But given that those people are in the Trump camp, if people want to see something different, they should push to have those people elevated over people like Paulson, who, used credit default swap fuckery to make $1 bazillion at the expense of lots of other people.